This is Jay Rogers. I'm the director of the Forerunner, and in this video, I'm going to look at an article I did called "The Pilgrims as Failed Socialists." And it is an excerpt from this book right here called Puritan Storm Rising. This has been out for a couple of weeks, and it's a little excerpt from one section in that book. There's a very common trope that you often hear around Thanksgiving. It's also in this book right here called Puritan Economic Experiments by Dr. Gary North. This is actually a great book, and I'd recommend people pick this up as well as Political Polytheism. Has a lot of good information in it, but I don't agree with some of the premises of the books and the conclusions. But nevertheless, the information is pretty good in it. It's well researched. But the basic idea of the Pilgrims as failed socialists is here. And what I'm going to do here is go to share. I'm going to share the article with you. And this is it right here. It's on Puritan, it's on theforerunner.com. And it's called The Pilgrims as Failed Socialists, question marks. And this is from my Puritan Storm Rising book, which you can see, or can you see that actually? Okay. All right. So did the Pilgrims almost fail in 1621 when they tried socialism? This is a frequent trope that's often trotted out by conservative and libertarian pundits around Thanksgiving. It seems to have its origin in a 1968 column by Henry Hazlitt at the height of the Cold War. The idea is that when the Pilgrims landed in Plymouth in 1620, the first governor, John Carver, had planned a communist utopia in the New World. This soon failed when the colonists became lazy and starvation and death resulted. Finally, after Carver and more than half the colonists had died, a wiser governor, William Bradford, decided to make each household produce their own stock of food from farming their own lot of land, lots of land. From then on, the Pilgrims prospered. Let us be thankful for this valued lesson from our fathers and yield not to the temptations of socialism, concluded Hazlitt. All right, so goes the anti-socialist story. Numerous others have repeated this legend, including Rush Limbaugh, John Stossell, and George Will. Okay, so this is pretty common. I see this every year. Uh, the way that Gary North puts it is like this: the Puritans had been compelled by a prior contract to set up a basically socialist system in 1620, the Common Storehouse, and had come very close to starving as a result. Couple of things wrong with that. One of them is that it's basically an idea called presentism. Presentism is when you take your current situation, your current understanding of economics, and impose it on people in the past. For instance, you know, you could say like, well, Ludwig von Mises, who is the um, founder of what they call the Austrian School of Economics. If only the Pilgrims had known the teachings of Ludwig von Mises, they could have done much better. They wouldn't have suffered disaster. And there is actually a grain of truth in this tale. This is, by the way, a very famous painting. It's the Mayflower Compact. You may have seen that before. That's the signing of the Mayflower Compact on the Mayflower prior to the landing. We'll talk about that in a minute too. All right, so there is a grain of truth in the article, I mean, in the tale. The problem is the timeline. And yes, the Pilgrims starved in the first few months after landing in Plymouth in December 1620. Many contracted scurvy, which is a vitamin deficiency common among seafarers while still aboard the Mayflower. And the effects of scurvy didn't really set in until after they were off the ship for a few weeks or a few months. And to compound the problem, the ship had been blown off course by storms, and they settled in a more northerly and colder part of the eastern seaboard when an unusually harsh winter was setting in. Carver set up a system of rations from the remaining stocks of food. In the spring, the remaining pilgrims, a little more than half of the original 102 colonists, worked together at a farm or common lot. However, by the time what has become known as the first Thanksgiving in the fall of 1621 occurred, there was an abundance of food. Bradford describes in his text of Plymouth Plantation the Fall Harvest Festival, or celebration, a 3-day feast shared with the Wampanoag, featuring activities like fowling and games. While Bradford doesn't explicitly use the term Thanksgiving in this context, he notes that the colonists set aside days for humiliation and rejoicing in God's blessing. It's kind of funny. I put this online and I get several people saying, no, 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 the first Thanksgiving took place in 1619 in Virginia. I have my Southern advocates there advocating for an earlier Thanksgiving. No one called it Thanksgiving at that time. That was later, but this is what happened during the time. It was a celebration that included a significant number of Wampanoag guests, including their leader, King Massasoit, and his men. So far from the first year being a failed experiment with communism, Bradford instead describes an abundance just months after the starving time. So this is from a Plymouth plantation here. They began now to gather in the small harvest they had, and to fit up their houses and dwellings against winter. So this would have been in the fall of 1621. Being all well recovered in health and strength, and had all the things in good plenty. For as some were employed in affairs abroad, others were exercised in fishing about cod and bass and other fish, of which they took good store, of which every family had their portion. All the summer there was no want, and now began to come in store of fowl. Everyone knows what fowl is, hopefully, ducks, geese, pheasants, and so on. As winter approached, turkey, as winter approached, of which this place did abound when they first came first, but afterward decreased by degrees. And besides waterfowl, there was a great store of wild turkeys, which they took many, besides venison, etc. Besides, they had about a peck of meal a week to a person, or now since harvest Indian corn to that portion, which made many Indian corn would be just regular corn, right? Like what we call corn, which made many afterwards write so largely of their plenty here to their friends in England, which were not vain but true reports. From the first summer onward, that was 1621, the Plymouth colony had no lack of food. Now, the grain of truth in this Pilgrims failed experiment with socialism legend comes from a decision of Bradford to cease the practice of farming a common plot of land and holding all the produce in the storehouse. So that went on throughout 1622. Like the next year, they still shared food together in a storehouse. But by 1623, this system called the Common Course was found to breed much confusion and discontent and retard much employment. For the young men who were most able and fit for labor and service did repine that they should spend their time and strength to work for other men's wives and children without recompense. Afterward, every family was assigned to its own parcel of land to farm. This had very good success, for it made all hands very industrious, so as much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been. By the way, back then, corn could have meant either wheat and grain, or specifically, Indian corn would be called Indian corn. According to the contract, so this is the problem with the thesis that this was socialism, okay? According to the contract the Plymouth Company held, for the first 7 years of the colony, all goods were to be held in joint stock. No land could be legally held by any of the colonists during this time. This was because the colony was an investment venture and the investors expected to be paid first. This was not due to communism, but a nascent capitalism. By this time in history, the joint stock company was a common investment system throughout Europe. Bradford's Plymouth colony initially held all goods within the common store, which was a temporary measure during an emergency situation which averted famine, but abandoned it later when it bred sloth and resentment. So they weren't required to starve before they sent all their money back to England. They could farm their own lots and so on, but they were required to pay back the investors. So in other words, that's not socialism or communism, that's capitalism. Like the Mayflower was paid for through the Plymouth Company, which were a group of investors. The journey was supplied every year by a new ship that came over with supplies by the investors. And they invested in the colony for 7 years. After the 7 years, they could have renewed the contract, but the investors expected to be paid. And there's a whole history behind that, which I won't get into. Gary North does get into this in his book, but he kind of uses it as a diatribe against socialism. But what I'm saying here is that um, what we're really doing is we're misappropriating history to try to create this diatribe against socialism. But that's not actually what was happening. What was happening is that they were paying back their capitalist investors And that common store was done only in the beginning because there was an emergency situation. It wasn't a plan, a long-term plan to do that. It was just done the first 2 years because Carver and then Bradford after wanted to make sure that everyone got fed in the winter. And in the first winter, everyone was fed. And by the second year, 1623, they decided to do away with it because they felt like um, people felt like they weren't being treated fairly, essentially. So when the leftists misappropriate and denigrate Puritan history, which they do all the time, by the way, um, they try to tarnish our great American Christian legacy in favor of their woke social justice agenda. That should irk us. Like they talk about how cruel the Pilgrims were to the Indians and so on, which is not exactly the truth of history, but we can get into that in another time, another video. So we shouldn't commit the same error by failing to notice the nuance in the details of the historical record and then try to bend it to our own ends. What we can derive from this experience is the lesson that governance ought to be moral and not coercive. The Pilgrim colony teaches us that lasting reform comes through changed hearts, not forced equality. A 21st century reformation must reject both libertine individualism and forced collectivism in favor of voluntary Christian order. Bradford's model is explicitly Christocentric, love not law, bind society. Modern reformers should focus on discipleship, not political coercion, recognizing that only the gospel transforms the culture from within. Love must reign as a principle for caring for those in need. Okay, so that's from my book. I also have the second section, which is the significance of the Mayflower Compact. This was the first written aboard the Mayflower because they did not have the right to land where they settled. They were supposed to go further south in the New York area, which was part of the Virginia territory at that time. And so what they decided was that they needed to have some laws set up that would govern the colony. Some of the sailors on the ship who were not, some of the adventurers who came with them who were not pilgrims, they decided that they would do whatever they want when they came ashore. So Carver and Bradford and the others forced them to sign this compact. And this was established when the Pilgrims found themselves outside their original governance and needs to exercise self-rule. There's another bit about people wanting to not obey any laws because they didn't have the right to in that territory. Um, the second thing is that this document served as a foundational charter, much like the basis for our nation. Like our Declaration of Independence is the Articles of Incorporation of our nation, and then later on there was a Constitution, which is more like the bylaws. But the Mayflower Compact articulated not only the source of their rights as coming from God, but also their philosophy of law. Okay, I'll do another time. I'll go through all of these different um, these different documents. But this is Puritan Storm Rising. This is the book right here. You can get it on Amazon or you can get it through my website. And I hope everyone had a happy Thanksgiving.